12 men walked on the moon, that number could have been 0. Between 1961 and 1972, NASA came within seconds, sometimes inches, of losing entire crews, entire missions, the whole program. One of those moments nearly stranded 2 astronauts on the lunar surface with no way home. We'll get to that, but first, 10 times Apollo almost didn't make it back. The Apollo program is remembered as a triumph. Rightfully so, but the margin between triumph and catastrophe was razor-thin, over and over again. These are the moments the history books move past too quickly. 36 seconds after Apollo 12 lifted off on November 14, 1969, lightning struck the vehicle. Then it struck again, 12 seconds later. Every warning light in the command module lit up simultaneously. The fuel cells dropped offline. The guidance platform tumbled. Commander Pete Conrad reported the cockpit looked like a Christmas tree. Flight controller John Aaron recognized the readout pattern from an obscure test failure a year earlier. He called up a switch setting, SCE to AUX, that almost no one in the room knew existed. Lunar module pilot Alan Bean found the switch. Power was restored. The Saturn V's guidance system, running on a separate circuit, had never faltered. The rocket kept flying perfectly straight while the crew above it thought they might be dying. If Bean hadn't found that switch within roughly 20 seconds, Mission Control would have called an abort. The moon landing would have been scrubbed. Apollo 10 was the dress rehearsal. Astronauts Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan flew the lunar module to within 47,000 feet of the moon's surface, close enough to see boulders, then staged for the return. When they jettisoned the descent stage, something went wrong immediately. The ascent stage began rolling, pitching, and yawing uncontrollably. In the audio recording, you can hear Cernan say something that NASA had to bleep for broadcast. The spacecraft spun almost 1 full rotation per second before Stafford identified the problem. A switch had been left in the wrong position, putting the craft into an automatic attitude seek mode that was fighting itself. He corrected it manually. The whole episode lasted roughly 8 seconds. Had they not regained control, the ascent stage would have tumbled into the lunar surface. There would have been no Apollo 11. When Neil Armstrong took manual control of the Eagle during the final descent, the original landing site was covered in boulders. He flew past it, searching. The 1202 program alarm had already fired multiple times, overloading the guidance computer. Flight controllers in Houston were making real-time decisions about whether to abort with almost no time to think. Armstrong found a clear patch and set down. What the broadcast didn't emphasize, at touchdown, the lunar module had an estimated 20 seconds of fuel remaining in the descent tanks. Some accounts say less. The rules called for an abort at 30 seconds. Armstrong was already below that threshold. If he hadn't found that clear patch when he did, or if he'd circled once more, they would have either aborted, jettisoning the descent stage mid-hover, or crashed. The first moon landing came down to a margin you could count on your hands. Apollo 16 nearly never landed at all. While John Young and Charlie Duke were already in the lunar module preparing for descent, Ken Mattingly in the command module noticed something alarming. The backup gimbal system on the main engine was oscillating. That engine was their only ride home from lunar orbit. If it fired incorrectly during the critical trans-Earth injection burn, the crew could be left in an orbit that decayed into the moon or sent them tumbling into deep space. Mission Control held the mission in lunar orbit for 6 hours running analysis. Engineers on the ground determined the oscillation was within acceptable limits, probably. Young and Duke landed, spent 3 days on the surface, and came home. But for 6 hours, the real question being asked in Houston was whether to send the crew home immediately without landing at all, or accept the risk. They accepted the risk. This one sounds small. It wasn't. On the second moonwalk of Apollo 17, Gene Cernan accidentally clipped the rear fender extension of the lunar rover with a hammer handle and broke it off. A fender might seem trivial. On the moon, it is not. The rover kicks up rooster tails of lunar regolith, fine, sharp, abrasive particles that coat everything they touch. Without the fender, the dust would blanket the astronauts' suits, visors, equipment, and critically, the rover's radiator. A dust-coated radiator overheats. An overheating rover fails. A failed rover on the Moon's surface, miles from the lunar module, means the astronauts walk back, if they can. Mission Control improvised a replacement fender from 4 pages of lunar maps, clamps from inside the cabin, and duct tape. It held for the remaining 2 moonwalks. The last men on the Moon almost didn't finish their last day there. On April 13, 1970, roughly 200,000 miles from Earth, an oxygen tank in Apollo 13's service module exploded. The cause was a damaged Teflon insulation on wiring inside the tank, damage that had occurred during ground testing months earlier and gone undetected. The explosion vented oxygen into space, took out 2 of 3 fuel cells, and left the command module on battery power alone. Jim Lovell looked out his window and said quietly that he could see gas venting into space. The crew abandoned the command module and used the lunar module as a lifeboat for 4 days. They had to execute a precisely calculated engine burn around the Moon to set a return trajectory, using a spacecraft designed for landing, not long-duration life support. Carbon dioxide levels climbed dangerously. The square CO2 scrubber canisters from the command module didn't fit the round holes in the lunar module. Engineers improvised a solution using a sock, a plastic bag, and a flight manual cover. January 27, 1967. Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were sitting inside Apollo 1 on the launch pad during a routine ground test. No fuel, no oxidizer. No one expected anything dangerous. The cabin atmosphere was pure oxygen at slightly above sea level pressure, standard practice at the time, inherited from Mercury and Gemini. At 6:31 p.m., a spark, most likely from damaged wiring under Grissom's seat, ignited the oxygen-rich environment. In that atmosphere, almost everything burns. The fire reached fatal temperatures in roughly 15 seconds. The inward opening hatch, which took at least 90 seconds to open under the best conditions, never opened in time. All 3 astronauts died. The entire Apollo program halted for 20 months. The command module was redesigned from its core. The atmosphere mixture was changed. The hatch was rebuilt to open outward in seconds. Without those deaths, the later missions, with all their near misses, likely would have had additional worse failures. Edgar Mitchell and Alan Shepard were descending toward the lunar surface in the Antares when Mission Control spotted something alarming in the telemetry. The abort switch was registering as triggered. If that signal was real, the ascent engine would fire automatically, separating them from the descent stage and sending them back into orbit, aborting the landing without any human decision being made. The cause appeared to be a tiny solder ball floating loose inside the switch, intermittently completing a circuit. Engineers and programmers at MIT had roughly 2 hours to write a software patch from scratch, test it on a simulator, and uplink it to a spacecraft already in powered descent. They did it. The patch forced the abort system to require 2 simultaneous signals before triggering. The landing proceeded. If the patch had failed, or if they'd run out of time, Shepard, the oldest man to walk on the Moon, never would have gotten there. This one happened before the mission, but it nearly meant Apollo 11 never had its commander. On May 6, 1968, 14 months before the lunar landing, Neil Armstrong was piloting the Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, a free-flying simulator used to train for the Moon approach. The LLRV was unstable by design, mimicking the Moon's gravity using a downward-facing jet engine. A propellant leak caused catastrophic loss of attitude control. Armstrong ejected at roughly 200 feet altitude, half a second before the craft hit the ground and exploded. His parachute barely had time to deploy. He landed in a field adjacent to the runway, bit his tongue on landing, and walked back to his office. According to colleagues, he was reviewing paperwork within the hour. Had he ejected a half-second later, or not at all, which was his instinct in other emergencies, Apollo 11 would have had a different commander, or a delayed launch, or both. Here's the moment promised at the beginning. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were preparing to leave the lunar surface when Aldrin noticed a broken piece of hardware on the floor of the cabin. It was the circuit breaker for the ascent engine arm switch, the switch that had to be engaged before the engine could fire. Without it, they could not leave. The breaker had been snapped off by a backpack during the moonwalk. They were on the moon. There were no spare circuit breakers. Ground teams had no solution. The astronauts had roughly 7 hours until their launch window. After that, the alignment with the orbiting command module would be lost, and Michael Collins would have to leave without them. Buzz Aldrin pushed the stub of a felt-tip pen into the breaker slot. It completed the circuit. The ascent engine fired. They came home. 2 men were nearly left on the moon, and the solution was a pen. A felt-tip pen, a sock and a flight manual. A switch setting almost no one knew. The Apollo program didn't just require engineering, it required people making the right call under conditions no simulation fully prepared them for. 12 men walked on the moon. The margin was never comfortable. There are more stories like these every week. Subscribe if you want to keep finding them.